Hello, and welcome to Nightmares. I'm the crone of Old Greenwich, and I'm so sad that I can't be with you in person at the Perrot Library to frighten you this Halloween. I do so enjoy seeing your terrified faces. But I'd like to thank the library for allowing me to frighten you virtually by sharing some of my favorite scary stories with you. And the first one I'd like to tell you takes place right here in Old Greenwich, a long time ago when Old Greenwich was just a few stores on Sound Beach Avenue and farmland all around. And on one of those farms lived two sisters, Sarah Jane and Elizabeth. Twin sisters they were, and when the story that I'm about to tell you takes place, they had just turned 10 years old. Now, I told you they lived on a farm, and when the story takes place, it was late in October, harvest time. Their father and their older brothers were out working in the fields late until the sun set, so that they could get the crops in before the frost came. And it was Sarah Jane and Elizabeth's job to bring them supper so that they could have a bite to eat and then work the rest of the evening. And so their mother called to them this particular night, and she said, "Girls, I want you to take this food out to your father and your brothers, but I want you to come right back, because I've got some more chores for you to do before the sun goes down." And Elizabeth said, "Oh yes, of course, Mother, we'll come right back." But Sarah Jane didn't say anything. Well, the girls set off with the food and utensils for their father and their brothers, and when they arrived out in the fields, they gave them the food, and they stood there and waited while the menfolk ate, and then they started back with just the forks, the dirty forks in their pockets. And Elizabeth said, "We'd better hurry back. Mother wants us to do some chores before the sun goes down." And Sarah Jane laughed and she said, "Oh, Elizabeth, you are such a goody two-shoes. I think we should take the long way back. And that way, by the time we get home, it'll be dark, and we won't have to do any of those old chores." And Elizabeth said, "I don't think that's a good idea. Mama's going to be awfully mad." Sarah Jane just laughed. She said, "I'm taking the long way. Are you coming with me or not?" And so, Sarah Jane and Elizabeth took the long way home. And the sun was just going down when they arrived at the gates of Tomac Cemetery. You know where that is? It was there back then too. They just arrived at the gates and it was getting dark. And Sarah Jane said, "You know, they buried that old witch in there today." "Oh, Sarah Jane, you shouldn't say that," said Elizabeth. "It's not nice to speak ill of the dead." Sarah Jane just laughed. "She was a witch," she said, "and I've a mind to go in there and find her grave and spit on it. That'd teach her." And Elizabeth said, "No, I don't think you should do that. That's not nice." Sarah Jane just laughed again. She said, "You're just a fraidy cat, Elizabeth. You're too scared to go in there and spit on her grave." Elizabeth said, "I'm not scared. I just think it's wrong. Besides, I don't think you're as brave as you say you are. Why, I bet you would go into the cemetery and hide behind a tree, and then you'd just tell me you'd spit on her grave, but you wouldn't really have done it." And Sarah Jane took that fork out of her apron pocket, and she said, "I'm gonna go in there and I'm going to spit on that old witch's grave. And then I'm going to stick this fork in the ground right next to her grave. That way you can come by tomorrow in broad daylight and you can see the fork and you'll know that I've been there. And so, while Elizabeth waited at the gates of the cemetery, Sarah Jane walked in. It was quite dark at this point, but she walked and she walked through the tombstones and around the trees until finally, at the back of the cemetery, she came to the old woman's grave. There was a big mound of freshly piled dirt on top of it and a long shadow across the dirt. But Sarah Jane walked right up to that grave and she spit on it. And then she bent over, took that fork, and stuck it in the ground. But right at that moment, she felt something grab at the hem of her dress. She tried to stand up, but it was pulling down on her. And in the moonlight, she looked down and she saw something white. And it looked like the fingers of a bony old hand. "She's got me!" she screamed. And then she fainted. Well, Elizabeth was still waiting at the gates of the cemetery, and she heard her sister scream. So she turned right around and she started running down the road to where her father and her brothers were. And they had finished their work by this time, so they were coming down that road as well. And the two of them that met about halfway. And she told them everything that had happened. And they all went rushing back to the cemetery with only a candle lantern to light their way. And they went into the graveyard, and they walked among those tombstones and around those trees until at last they came to the old woman's grave. And there was that mound of dirt, and on top of that dirt lay Sarah Jane. Well, her father went rushing over to his daughter, and he started shaking her. Sarah Jane, wake up, wake up." And finally, Sarah Jane opened her eyes, and she saw her father, and she said, Oh, Daddy, the witch, she grabbed my dress, and she tried to drag me into the grave with her. And her father lifted that candle lantern and shined it all around Sarah Jane and that grave. They all started to laugh because it was obvious what had happened. When Sarah Jane had stuck that fork into the ground, she stuck it right through the hem of her dress. And it was only the fork that had grabbed hold of her and was trying to drag her into that grave. Now, Sarah Jane lived to be an old woman, even older than me, if you can believe it. But she never again spit on anyone's grave. And she never used a fork for anything but eating. And that's the story of Sarah Jane and Elizabeth. You might think about that story if you walk by Tomac Cemetery at night. Now, the next story I'm going to tell you is one of my favorites because it's about food, and I love stories about food. Once upon a time, a long time ago, there lived a little old man and a little old woman and a little old boy, and they lived way up high in the mountains of West Virginia in a little old cabin. And one day, the little old man was out working, and little old woman called to the little old boy, and she said, "Boy, I want you to go out into the garden and pick some beans for supper." "Yes, ma'am, Mama," said the little old boy, and so he got his pail, and he went out, and he started picking beans in the garden, and as he was picking, he noticed something sticking up from the ground, and he looked a little closer, and he saw that it was a great big toe. The little old boy, he grabbed hold of that toe, and he started to yank it. And he yanked it, and he yanked it, and he yanked it some more until finally it broke off in his hand. And then he heard something groan and scamper away. Well, he took that big toe into the house and he showed it to the little old woman, and she said, "Oh my, will you look at that, it's a toe." And you know, they were kind of a poor family, and they hadn't had any meat to eat in weeks and weeks. And so the little old woman, she took that toe and she cut it into 3 pieces, and she put some breadcrumbs on it, and then she put some butter in her frying pan and threw that 3 pieces of toe right in the frying pan, and she started to fry it all up. Did it smell good? Well, pretty soon the little old man came home, and he walked in the door, and he gave a big sniff, and he said, "Honey, what's that you're cooking?" And she said, "It's toe, dear." And he said, "Well, it sure does smell good." And after that toe was all fried up, nice and crispy, and the beans were cooking in the pot and nice and tender, the little old boy set the table, and they all sat down around the table, and they ate the beans, and they ate that big toe. It was good. Well, after they'd eaten it all up, they cleaned up their dishes, and then they all sat around the fire, each in their own chair, and thought they'd just have a nice relaxing evening at home, when they heard a voice coming from way off in the distance. And the voice said, "Where's my toe?" The little old man, he got scared. He jumped up and hid under the bed. But the little old boy, little old woman, they stayed on, just sitting in their chairs, trying to relax. And then they heard the voice again, only this time it was closer. "Where's my toe?" Well, the little old woman, she got scared. She jumped up and hid under the bed. But the little old boy stayed on, kind of scared, but kind of sleepy too. In fact, his eyes were just about to close when he heard the gate chain rattling. "Where's my toe?" He heard something clawing on the porch roof. "Where's my toe?" He heard something crawling on the house roof. "Where's my toe?" He heard something scratching in the chimney. He saw soot falling down from the chimney. He got up and he looked up into the chimney, and there on the smoke ledge was a great, big, hairy, old goblin. "Where's my toe?" Well, the little old boy was so frightened, he could hardly move. he looked at that creature and he said, "What you got such big eyes for? Stare you through, stare you through. What you got such long claws for? Dig your grave, dig your grave. What you got such a long bushy tail for? Sweep your grave, sweep your grave. What you got such long, sharp, snaggly teeth for? Eat you up!" And he did. So the lesson here, my friends, is that if you are ever out in your garden or anywhere else, and you see a toe sticking up from the ground, leave it there. Don't touch it. Well, my friends, I hope that I have given you some nightmares. Have a happy Halloween.